What is the most decisive advantage you can have in aerial warfare? Perhaps it's a plane that can fly faster or higher than any other on the planet, or a fighter jet that's the size of a small house but is functionally invisible to radar. Perhaps it's a long-range missile that never misses, or a heavy bomber aircraft that's all but impervious to enemy fire. Or maybe it's about the people behind the craft, having the best and brightest in the world sitting in your nation's cockpit. Or perhaps, as formidable as all of those advantages are, it's actually none of the above. In order to answer the question, we'll boil this down to a very simple reality. Planes fly. And if my planes can fly longer than your planes, and in fact fly long enough that all your planes have to go back to base and refuel, then I suppose I've just conquered your airspace, haven't I? And across the entire world, no nation is better at keeping its planes in the sky than the United States. By a long shot. The United States fields hundreds upon hundreds of aerial refueling aircraft, several times more than the aerial tankers of every other nation in the world combined. And the backbone of that refueling fleet? Well, that would be the KC-135 Stratotanker, serving faithfully for the better part of a full 7 decades and all but guaranteed to cross that 70-year mark before retirement. It's not a fighter, it's not a bomber, it's not a spy plane, it's a gas station. And it's the most effective tool of aerial warfare that the United States has ever had. Now, World War II was, in many ways, a war of wonder weapons, from the V-2 rocket, the jet-powered Messerschmitt Me-262, to a whole long list of rather crazy proposals from Nazi Germany, as well as radar and the atom bomb from the Allied powers. But as staggeringly as effective as many of these weapons were, we can only imagine how different the war might have been if a different wonder weapon had arrived just a bit earlier. First entering service in 1950, the Boeing-designed KC-97 Stratofreighter was just a tad too late to serve in Europe or the Pacific, but nonetheless it was a major innovation. Equipped with a flying boom and carrying massive amounts of jet fuel, the KC-97 was the world's first aerial tanker, and with over 800 produced, it quickly became a major investment for the US military. More important for our purposes today, it was also the predecessor of the KC-135. But the KC-97 also came with a few problems. Most significantly, it was a prop plane trying to operate in a world quickly giving itself over to jet aircraft. That meant that when a jet wanted to refuel with it, it would have to slow all the way down to the speed of a propeller aircraft, which in the KC-97's case was about 230 miles an hour. The KC-97 also flew relatively low to the ground, exposing its companion planes to anti-air fire in austere environments. Even though modifications during its service life made it a bit more compatible with aircraft that it was trying to support, the tanker still had a rather hard time keeping up with the rest of the US Air Fleet. Just before we continue with today's episode, I do want to talk to you about something that's becoming more essential by the day: online privacy and security. Look, you see, the internet can be a pretty wild place, and protecting your online activity is an absolute must, and that's where Surfshark VPN comes in. So, what's the deal? Well, Surfshark solves a big problem that we all face: keeping our online activity private and secure. It's like putting on a virtual mask for your internet life. No more worrying about prying eyes, hackers, or nosy advertisers. Surfshark has your back. Now let's talk practicality. Surfshark is ridiculously easy to use. You just click, you connect, and bam, you're good to go. Your internet connection is private and secure. It is a VPN for everyone, from the tech-savvy to the really not tech-savvy at all. Plus, ever had your location mess up your plans? Well, with Surfshark, your virtual location is where you want it to be. Whether you're streaming, shopping, or working remotely, you are in control. Say goodbye to location-based restrictions. With over 3,200 servers in 100 countries, GPS spoofing on Android, and a kill switch for ultimate protection, Surfshark has it all. Plus, they won't collect your data, and their servers are 100% RAM only, ensuring your privacy. It's budget-friendly, grants you location freedom, and makes your travels even more exciting. Plus, I've got a deal for you. Use the promo code MEGA or visit surfshark.deals/mega for an incredible extra 3 months free. Thank you to Surfshark, and remember, protect your internet activity with Surfshark. And now back to today's episode. So, within just a few years after the KC-97 entered service, the US Air Force had already decided that their relationship with the tanker just wasn't going to work out. In 1954, the Air Force's Strategic Air Command announced a competition to produce a replacement with a fairly simple set of requirements. It had to be a working aerial refuel plane, and it had to have jets on it. Done. Appropriately for the Air Force, both then and of now, it was the Lockheed Company that eventually received the heavy contract, beating out Boeing, Douglas, Convair, and Fairchild. The Lockheed design expanded on a jet that Lockheed was already planning to build for commercial aviation purposes, the L-193 Constellation II. To put simply, the plane's fuselage would have been modified into a fuel tanker rather than a compartment for passengers. But the Lockheed plane had one major drawback. It was just a series of designs at a moment when a replacement for the Air Force's bumbling Stratofreighter was already badly needed. But the executives and the engineers at the Boeing company, watching this issue emerge from the sidelines, must have had some pretty substantial grins on their faces because they, unlike Lockheed, were already prepared with a solution. Since 1952, Boeing had been working on a proof-of-concept demonstration plane that was supposed to show that jet transport and commercial aviation were compatible. This plane, known as the Boeing 367-80, was already flying a prototype by the time the Air Force came calling, and the folks over at Boeing had a sneaking suspicion that the Air Force's exact demands were coming. It was no secret that their current tanker was a little bit outdated, so Boeing had already made sure to build their jet airliner prototype with all the right bells and whistles to easily turn it into a tanker. And once Boeing showed these capabilities to the Air Force, the Strategic Air Command wasn't willing to look that sort of gift horse in the mouth. By the end of 1954, Boeing received a production order of 29 of the planes as a temporary stopgap until the Lockheed design became available. But spoiler alert, the Lockheed planes never actually entered service, not as a tanker and not as a jetliner either. By the time they would have been ready, it was more than clear that the Boeing model was going to do just fine. The construction process for the prototypes required the use of massive amounts of aluminium and rubber, over 14.5 miles of electrical wiring, and contributions from nearly 4,000 American small businesses in all 50 states. By 1956, the first production line tanker, dubbed the KC-135 Stratotanker, was already in the sky, and it was delivered to Castle Air Force Base in California less than a year later. And with that, the age of the Stratotanker had begun, and there was no going back. Now, in order to discuss the specifications of the KC-135, we've got to pick a version of the aircraft to talk about. Between its many refits, upgrades, and variants, the baseline Stratotanker looks very different than the aircraft that are flying around today. So, in order to keep things consistent, we're going to discuss the relatively modern KC-135R, which should help explain why the things had such a long service life. The Stratotanker has slightly smaller, but generally similar outward specifications compared to the Boeing 737. A length of 136 feet, that's 41.5 meters, and a wingspan of 131 feet, or 40 meters. When it's empty, the plane weighs just short of 100,000 pounds, that's 45,000 kilos, but when it's fully loaded, its engines can support more than 3 times that weight, including 200,000 pounds in just fuel alone. The KC-135R is powered by 4 turbofan engines with 21,600 pound force to thrust each, upgraded significantly from older models, and it's typically flown with a crew of 3, including a pilot, co-pilot, and a boom operator. On occasion, a navigator will fly with the crew as well. In terms of maintenance, it's designed to be modular and easily repaired in field conditions, and though it requires a runway of over a mile in order to take off and land, its range is more than enough for it to fly from well-established forward operating bases in friendly countries. The KC-130 boasts a maximum speed of 580 miles per hour. That's 0.9 times the speed of sound. Its cruising speed isn't much lower at about 530 miles per hour. The plane features a range of 1,500 miles, meaning that it can hang out in the sky for multiple hours at a time conducting refueling missions, and when it's using its ferry range, it can travel up to 11,000 miles, nearly half the distance required to circumnavigate the globe. The plane can fly at up to 50,000 feet, putting it well out of the range of enemy ground forces and establishing a safe buffer zone where friendly aircraft can refuel basically unimpeded. When the KC-135R isn't loaded with fuel, it can be refitted as a transport plane with the capacity to transport up to 80 passengers, or as a medical evacuation plane with the addition of 2 flight nurses and 3 medical technicians. The plane carries no weapons, but recent efforts to add missile countermeasures, an early warning defense system, and even armed drone ringmen are all underway. And then there's the KC-135's most interesting feature. And that, of course, is its refueling boom. Operated manually from a dedicated boom pod, the boom relies on fuel lines made up of over 15 pumps and 50 valves. It's got the capacity to transfer multiple tons of fuel to planes in just a couple of minutes. So much, in fact, that the fuel it transfers in just 60 seconds could operate a family SUV for over a year. During refueling operations, both the boom operator and the Stratotanker pilot must operate with extreme finesse at a distance of about 20 feet from the aircraft they're refueling. A catastrophic collision is always just a badly timed sneeze away. But when a Stratotanker operates at peak efficiency, it is an incredible sight. The plane can fully refuel 16 F-16 fighter jets, including 2 external fuel tanks per jet, with the load it carries on a single flight. And of the 803 total Stratotankers that have been produced, a number of unique variants have come about with time. The KC-135B was initially intended to function as an airborne command and control plane, although they've later been refitted as other, better planes came around to do that job. The Q variant was built to carry the specialized fuel needed for the SR-71 Blackbird, and the R variant became a reconnaissance plane of its own, primarily used to check out above-ground nuclear test sites. Lastly, 2 lucky KC-135s were refitted to serve as target practice for the experimental Boeing YAL-1, used as a testbed for later laser missile defense systems. Outside, the US Stratotankers operated service to France, Turkey, and Chile, as well as by Singapore until June 2019. Funnily enough, Italy hasn't procured any built-to-order KC-135s, but they've taken some civilian Boeing 707s and refitted them for tanker duty, meaning that they've got functionally the same basic aircraft. So, the Stratotanker first entered service in the late 1950s, meaning that its first major conflict was the Vietnam War. Before long, they proved themselves invaluable to the American war effort, not just refueling planes, but also early helicopters, whose range was massively improved as a result. During the war, Stratotankers started maintaining air refueling control points, also known as ACRPs, where they would fly in long, slow ovals of several hundred miles circumference, often sharing the same oval between several or even dozens of the tankers. In just 1966 alone, over 50 planes were saved from crashing due to low fuel by Stratotanker crews, and the list of combat missions they made possible is much longer than just 50. Perhaps the Stratotanker's most notable moment during Vietnam was the so-called Peanuts incident, when 4 pilots flying F-105 fighters and heavy bombs were sent on a mission to bomb a railroad between North Vietnam and China. Caught up in a dogfight, the F-105s used a good deal more fuel than they expected, and although their mission had already included 2 planned refuelings, they found themselves in need of aid far sooner than they'd expected. Not only that, but they couldn't even climb to a safe altitude in order to return. In response, a KC-135 flew alone into enemy territory to attempt to refuel despite a complete lack of fighter protection or even onboard defenses. Flying low, the KC-135 and the F-105 fighters struggled to find each other, but eventually did so. With the flight leader's fuel gauge at 0 and another plane carrying just 100 pounds of fuel when the Stratotanker intercepted them, all 4 planes were successfully refueled at the last possible second. Everyone involved got home safely. Another daring mission was flown in May 1967 by the 902nd Air Refueling Squadron led by Major Alvin Lewis. On their second refueling flight that day, Lewis and his Stratotanker crew were called upon by a pair of F-105s who had been trying to protect the airspace over the site where another F-105 had crashed, doing their best to keep the zone safe until an evacuation could arrive. However, the zone was located past Vietnam's demilitarized zone, and the F-105s lingered so long that they no longer had adequate fuel to reach a friendly airbase. Major Lewis and his crew were nearly out of fuel for the day, but nonetheless they piloted their KC-135 close enough to make contact. Because of the Stratotanker's own low fuel, Major Lewis informed the pilots that they'd have to do an unorthodox refueling and that he could only supply enough fuel to get the F-105s away from the jungle. In what must have been an absolutely wild sight, Lewis and his Stratotanker careened into position just in time to help one of the F-105s, which flamed out right as it was getting close enough to refuel. But rather than bailing, the pilot was able to guide his fighter into a coordinated downward glide with the Stratotanker, both hurtling towards the ground in hope that the pilot could restart his engine. Mercifully, the F-105's engine restarted just in time, and the pilot pulled away to leave room for the other fighter, whose own engine was on the verge of failing because of the dive. The Stratotanker diverted its line to this jet, filling it up as best they could, and then went back to the first jet, who'd gotten just barely enough fuel to stay airborne. In a situation where any number of slight, panicked miscalculations might have led to a crash, or either the fighters or the tanker running out of fuel, the Stratotanker crew managed to get it just right, and each of the aircraft was able to land safely. The Stratotanker crew would earn the Distinguished Flying Cross for their work, and all parties involved would escape with their lives. Across its range of missions in Vietnam, the KC-135 would be instrumental in extending the mission range of F-4 fighters and B-52 bombers, enabling them to strike deep within enemy territory or stay in the air over nearby hot zones for hours at a time, rather than just a few minutes. This turned them into a force multiplier, a way for the United States to do far more with their existing equipment and personnel than might otherwise have been possible. Not only that, but they were often able to escort damaged aircraft back to a landing zone, helping them to limp along even when their fuel tanks were punctured until the planes could land, or at the very least, the pilot could eject over safe territory. The story of the Stratotanker in Vietnam was filled with these kind of highlights. Over the course of the war, the KC-135 would complete 813,000 aerial refuelings. Outside of Vietnam, the Stratotanker was the Air Force's designated tanker to maintain readiness for an outbreak of hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union. In keeping with this mission, dozens of Stratotankers were kept at the ready at a given time, poised to take off and take part in strategic nuclear bombings at just a moment's notice. And during the plane's service life, it's seen a number of critical updates that have helped it keep pace with the F-14s and F-15s of the post-Vietnam years, the B-2 Spirit bombers of the turn of the 21st century, and even the fifth-generation fighter aircraft of today. Its wings have been redesigned and reskinned to be sturdier and more durable. Its engines have continued to get better and better with time, and it's received massive upgrades to its avionics, including modern glass cockpit, digital displays, and a complete refit. The plane was instrumental during the Gulf War, completing tens of thousands more refuelings, and they've been utilized extensively through US operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Almost 400 of the planes are still in service today and still receiving modifications. Just a few months ago, in March of 2023, the Air Force announced that it was ready to add winglets to the planes, which should improve fuel efficiency and save up to $65 million a year in operating costs. Of course, the Stratotanker's service life has been anything but perfect, with such a particular and dangerous mission, and one that requires precision from all parties involved. The planes have been involved in a long list of crashes and accidents. As of 2020, 52 of the planes have been lost to accidents at a rate of slightly less than one per year. In those accidents, 385 people have lost their lives. One particularly catastrophic accident in 1965. A Stratotanker crashed after a rudder malfunction in Kansas, hitting an intersection in the highway of Wichita and killing 30 people. A year later, in 1966, a B-52 collided with a KC-135 while refueling, causing the deaths of 7 people between the crews of both planes and causing nuclear weapons to drop from the B-52 into the sea and even land in Spain. Thankfully, they were recovered. And in March of 1982, a Stratotanker exploded in midair at an altitude of 13,700 feet with 27 people on board. All of them were killed in the incident. Luckily, the rate of accidents has gone down with time. Only 5 of the planes had accidents in the 1990s and only 2 since the year 2000s, and that's included just 3 fatalities. But even still, the Stratotanker has had more accidents than most of the planes that the Air Force has flown. It's important to view those numbers in context, though. The Stratotanker has flown an ungodly number of missions over time, often in austere conditions, and the planes have been provided far better and more consistent maintenance in the past few decades. They still have a difficult track record of runway accidents and mid-flight incidents outside of fueling, and the fact that those have gotten less frequent with time would indicate that these planes had quite a few fixable issues early in their service lives. And with the Stratotanker ready to hit 70 years of service in 2027, there's one thing that we've got to discuss. And that's, of course, their retirements, which the KC-135 has done a fantastic job of dodging so far. The Stratotanker has been supplemented since 1981 by the heavier KC-10 extender, but with only 62 of the planes produced, they've got no real hope of replacing the Stratotanker in America's missions around the world. That task, instead, falls to the Boeing KC-46 Pegasus, but well, that's a bit of a long story. Introduced to service in 2019 with over 80 available today, the Pegasus program started all the way back in 2006 and has been beset by a massive number of delays. Even upon delivery, the Pegasus took years to be cleared for active operational use, and cost-cutting has led the newer plane to go from a potential complete replacement for the Stratotanker to a partial replacement, meaning that the KC-135 is likely to be flying for quite a while longer. New programs to replace the KC-135, called the KC-Y and KC-Z programs, have also been cancelled within the last year. Those programs would have seen 175 KC-Y tankers produced, basically to tide the Air Force over for a few years until a dedicated KC-Z tanker was produced in the 2040s. But according to Air Force Assistant Secretary Andrew Hunter, that replacement program no longer makes sense. Instead, the new plan is for the Air Force to hold out with what it has until a next-generation refueling platform can be developed. According to Hunter, this next-generation platform will be completely unlike any existing civilian aircraft, meaning that it'll have a lengthy design process that Hunter projects to be completed in the mid to late 2030s. In all likelihood, the introduction of this new system will be the moment that the Stratotanker says goodbye. But with no idea what such a design could be, we really can't say much about that. What we can say is that until that day comes, the Stratotanker will be more than capable of filling in for the interim. These days, it's expensive to maintain, it's outdated, and the Air Force has made no bones about their desire to move on. But even with that said, the KC-135 seems able to compete a good while longer, especially leaning on the other tankers in the US Air Fleet. One day, the Air Force will be truly able to replace its iconic tanker, and the KC-135 will finally give its farewell to active service. Until then, it'll continue onward as an unsung American war hero and perhaps the most critically important plane that the US Air Force has ever flown.